In the forest, the shepherd dog Bailey found 3 puppies. John decided to take them home, not knowing it would change his life. The puppies turned out to be something entirely different from what they seemed. What do you think they are? Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know which country you're from. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to find out what happens next. The forest was a familiar sanctuary for John. Its towering trees, blanketed in moss, whispered ancient secrets as the wind brushed through their branches. Every morning, he and his shepherd dog Bailey ventured into these woods, relishing the crisp air and the quiet escape from the buzz of the nearby town. Bailey, always alert and brimming with energy, darted ahead, her paws barely making a sound on the carpet of fallen leaves. On this particular morning, the forest felt different. The air was heavier, carrying a peculiar stillness that John couldn't quite place. Bailey, who usually bounded through the trails with infectious enthusiasm, suddenly stopped. Her ears perked, her nose twitching as she caught a scent carried by the faint breeze. "What is it, girl?" John asked, following her gaze into the dense underbrush. Bailey didn't respond. Instead, she let out a low whine and took a cautious step forward, her posture tense. John's curiosity was piqued. He pushed aside a tangle of branches, his boots crunching softly against the undergrowth, and that's when he saw them. 3 tiny figures, huddled together in a patch of ferns, barely visible against the dappled light filtering through the canopy. At first glance, they looked like ordinary puppies, small, with soft, scruffy fur and wide, blinking eyes. But something about their stillness struck John as unusual. They didn't rush toward him or Bailey, as abandoned dogs might. Instead, they watched him, their eyes glinting with an intensity he couldn't quite explain. Bailey stayed rooted to the spot, her instincts seemingly at odds. She didn't bark or growl, instead, she let out a soft whimper, as if unsure of what to make of the situation. John crouched down, speaking in a soothing voice. "Hey there, little ones. What are you doing out here all alone?" The puppies didn't move. Their tiny bodies trembled, more from fear than the chill in the air, John guessed. He took another step closer, his heart breaking at their vulnerability. Who could leave them here, in the middle of nowhere? It was miles to the nearest road, and there were no signs of a mother nearby. "Looks like you've been on your own for a while," he murmured, his voice soft as he extended his hand. One of the pups, the smallest of the 3, let out a hesitant yip and sniffed his fingers cautiously. Bailey finally moved closer, her tail wagging tentatively. Her presence seemed to reassure the puppies, who began to relax, their fear giving way to exhaustion. John made his decision then and there. "All right," he said, scooping the smallest pup into his arms. "You're coming with me." One by one, he carefully lifted the others, cradling them gently. They felt light, almost weightless, a testament to how long they had gone without proper care. He wrapped them in his jacket to keep them warm, their tiny faces peeking out as they nestled against his chest. Bailey walked close by, her eyes darting between John and the pups, as if to say she was ready to protect them if needed. The hike back to the house felt longer than usual, the weight of his discovery settling heavily on John's mind. He didn't know where these puppies had come from or what they had endured, but he was certain of one thing: their journey had only just begun. John's cabin, nestled on the edge of the woods, was a warm refuge from the biting chill of the outside world. As he carried the 3 shivering puppies inside, he could feel their small bodies trembling against his chest. Setting them gently on the worn wooden floor, he watched as they cautiously explored their surroundings, their tiny paws slipping on the smooth surface. Bailey trotted in behind him, her usual confident demeanor replaced by quiet vigilance. She kept her eyes fixed on the newcomers, her ears twitching at every sound they made. John chuckled, misinterpreting her behavior as mild jealousy. "Don't worry, Bailey," he said, kneeling to scratch behind her ears. "You're still my number 1. He turned his attention back to the puppies, who were now huddled together in a corner, their wide eyes scanning the unfamiliar space. They were small, so small that John guessed they couldn't be more than a few weeks old. Their scruffy coats, a mix of gray and brown, were matted with dirt from the forest floor. He made a mental note to give them a gentle bath later. "All right, little ones," John said softly, fetching an old blanket and spreading it near the fireplace. "This should keep you warm." One by one, he lifted the puppies and placed them on the blanket. They snuggled together instantly, letting out tiny, contented sighs. John couldn't help but smile. It had been years since his home felt this lively. Over the next few days, the puppies began to settle into their new life. John found himself falling into a routine, feeding them, cleaning up after their inevitable messes, and watching as they explored every corner of the cabin. They were playful and clumsy, tumbling over each other in their excitement. Despite their timid beginnings, the pups quickly warmed up to him. The smallest one, whom John had nicknamed Tiny, seemed particularly attached, often following him from room to room on unsteady legs. Another, a slightly larger pup with strikingly bright eyes, had a mischievous streak, always nibbling at John's boots or dragging Bailey's toys into their corner. The third pup, the quietest of the trio, often sat back, observing everything with a calm intensity that seemed out of place for its age. Bailey, however, was not as enthusiastic. At first, John attributed her aloofness to jealousy. She would watch from a distance, her head tilted as if trying to understand these tiny invaders. When the pups tried to approach her, she would sniff them cautiously before retreating to her favorite spot by the window. John found her behavior amusing. "You'll get used to them," he said, ruffling her fur. "They're just puppies, after all." As the days turned into weeks, John began to notice subtle changes in Bailey. She became more restless, often pacing the cabin at night. Her usual enthusiasm during their morning walks waned, replaced by a watchfulness that he hadn't seen before. She seemed especially wary when the puppies were near, her ears flattening slightly whenever they ventured too close. John dismissed it as an adjustment period. "She'll come around," he reassured himself. "It's probably just the new smells." But there were other things, two small, almost imperceptible oddities that John tried to ignore. The way the puppies moved, sometimes in perfect unison, as if silently communicating. The way they rarely barked or whimpered, instead letting out soft, guttural sounds that reminded him of something wild. And their eyes, those sharp, piercing eyes that seemed to follow him everywhere. Tiny, in particular, had a habit of staring at him for long stretches of time, her head slightly tilted as if studying him. It was endearing at first, but as the days went by, it began to feel unsettling. Bailey, meanwhile, grew more distant. She stopped sleeping in her usual spot by the fireplace and instead took to lying near the door, as if standing guard. John noticed how she would sometimes let out a low growl in her sleep, her paws twitching as though chasing unseen prey. Despite Bailey's unease, the puppies seemed perfectly content. They thrived under John's care, their fur growing shinier, their small bodies filling out with each passing day. He was proud of how far they'd come since that cold morning in the woods. Still, there was a nagging feeling he couldn't shake, an inexplicable tension that hung in the air whenever the puppies and Bailey were in the same room. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. John chose to ignore it. After all, they were just puppies. Weren't they? Then there were the sounds. Late at night, John began hearing faint, guttural noises coming from their corner. At first, he assumed it was normal puppy behavior, maybe they were play fighting or dreaming. But the sounds didn't match. They weren't whimpers or playful growls, they were deeper, almost vocalizations, like murmured conversations in a language he couldn't understand. One night, he crept out of bed and tiptoed toward the source of the noise. The pups were wide awake, sitting in a loose circle, their heads low and close together. As he approached, they stopped instantly, their heads snapping toward him in unison. "Hey, what's going on here?" he asked, forcing a laugh to mask his discomfort. They didn't move, didn't blink. The silence was so thick it made his chest tighten. Finally, Bailey padded over, breaking the tension with a low growl. The pups scattered back to their blanket, their movements quick and deliberate. As the days passed, their wild instincts became harder to ignore. They began to avoid the comforts most dogs sought. They didn't curl up by the fireplace or beg for attention. Instead, they preferred the cold stone floor near the door, where they could see outside. On several occasions, John caught them pressing their noses to the windows, their eyes scanning the dark treeline with a focus that made his stomach churn. Bailey grew more restless, her pacing more frequent. She avoided the pups entirely now, keeping to herself or sticking close to John. Her growls grew sharper, more frequent, and directed not at intruders but at the very creatures she shared the house with. "They're just puppies," John reminded her one evening, though his own voice wavered. "They're not a threat." But even as he said the words, doubt gnawed at him. By the third month, the puppies were no longer small. Their lean bodies had filled out with taut muscle, and their paws, which had once seemed oversized, now carried them with a swift, silent grace. They had outgrown the cozy blanket by the fireplace and preferred sprawling across the cool wooden floor, their sharp eyes always scanning their surroundings. Their presence changed the atmosphere of the cabin. Bailey, once confident and unshakable, now avoided them entirely, sticking close to John with an air of unease. She refused to eat near them, her low growls constant whenever they came too close. John watched this growing tension with a mix of concern and denial. He wanted to believe that Bailey was simply being territorial, that she would eventually adapt to the dogs she now shared her space with. But in the back of his mind, a quiet voice whispered the truth he didn't want to face. The breaking point came one evening during their walk. It was twilight, the fading sun casting long shadows through the trees. The puppies had started to roam farther ahead than usual, their movements smooth and deliberate, their noses low to the ground as if tracking something unseen. John called for them to stay close, but they didn't respond. Instead, they quickened their pace, disappearing into the thick underbrush. "Bailey, come on," John urged, following their trail. His heart raced as he heard a series of guttural growls and snapping sounds up ahead. Pushing past a cluster of branches, he froze at what he saw. The three puppies had cornered a young deer. Their bodies were low to the ground, their tails stiff, and their eyes locked on their prey. It wasn't a playful chase, this was a calculated hunt. The smallest of the trio, Tiny, moved first, her leap swift and precise as she lunged for the deer's hind leg. The other two followed, their coordination eerily perfect. "Stop!" John shouted, his voice startling the animals. For a moment, the puppies hesitated, their heads snapping toward him in unison. Their eyes glowed in the dim light, sharp and wild. It was in that instant that he saw them for what they truly were, not dogs, but wolves. The realization hit him like a blow. These weren't domesticated animals, they were predators, born and bred for survival in the wild. And he had been raising them in his home. Back at the cabin, John sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. Bailey lay at his feet, her body tense, her eyes fixed on the wolves, who had returned from the forest as if nothing had happened. They moved with an air of quiet confidence, their actions betraying none of the chaos they had caused in the woods. John couldn't ignore it any longer. The way they moved, the way they hunted, even the way they looked at him, it all pointed to one undeniable truth. These were not pets. They were wild animals. He glanced at Bailey, whose quiet growl rumbled like a warning. She had known all along, hadn't she? From the moment they entered the cabin, she had sensed what he hadn't been willing to see. "What have I done?" he muttered, running a hand through his hair. He had taken them in out of kindness, but now he realized the weight of that decision. Wolves were not meant to live in houses, to be treated as pets. They belonged to the wilderness, where their instincts could run free. But after months under his care, could they even survive in the wild? And more pressing, could he survive them? Over the next few days, John's interactions with the wolves became strained. They were no longer the playful, clumsy creatures he had found in the forest. Their behavior had shifted subtly but unmistakably. They no longer sought his attention or wagged their tails in excitement when he entered the room. Instead, they watched him with a quiet intensity, their movements deliberate and unhurried. Bailey became his shadow, refusing to leave his side. Her growls grew sharper, her teeth bared whenever the wolves came too close. For the first time, John began to wonder if she was right to be afraid. John stood at the edge of the forest, his breath visible in the cool morning air. The wolves, no longer puppies, but powerful, graceful creatures, moved silently around him. Their sleek coats shimmered under the faint light of dawn, their eyes sharp and alert. For months, fear had dominated his relationship with them. But now, something deeper had begun to emerge, something he couldn't quite name but felt growing stronger every day. The shift began unexpectedly. One evening, as John was chopping wood near the cabin, a sudden rustle in the underbrush drew his attention. He turned, his heart racing as a shadow moved between the trees. A moment later, a coyote darted into view, its sharp eyes fixed on him. It was alone, but its movements were predatory, calculated. Before John could react, the largest of the wolves, whom he had started calling Shadow, appeared at his side. There was no growl, no bark. Shadow simply stood there, his presence enough to send the coyote skittering back into the forest. The other two wolves emerged moments later, forming a loose circle around John, their postures protective. It was the first time John truly felt safe in their presence. He crouched down, his voice soft. "Thank you," he murmured, his hand trembling as it rested on Shadow's thick fur. The wolf didn't pull away. As days turned into weeks, the wolves' behavior toward John shifted further. They no longer kept their distance or watched him with wary eyes. Instead, they began to approach him with an openness that felt deliberate. Tiny, the smallest and most curious of the trio, often sat near him as he worked, her head resting on her paws. The others would follow, their sharp eyes scanning the horizon but always staying within reach. One particularly cold night, as the fire crackled in the hearth, John awoke to find all three wolves lying near his bed. They weren't huddled together as they often were but spread out, as if they had chosen to keep watch over him from every angle. Bailey, who had grown uneasy in their presence, seemed to relax for the first time in weeks, curling up at his feet without a growl. That night, John slept better than he had in months. The bond was put to the test one stormy afternoon. John had ventured into the woods to gather firewood when his foot slipped on a patch of wet moss. He tumbled down a small slope, landing hard on his side. Pain shot through his ankle, sharp and unforgiving. He tried to stand, but the injured limb gave out beneath him. Rain began to fall, soaking through his clothes as he sat there, helpless. He called for Bailey, but she was too far off to hear. Panic began to set in until he heard the soft crunch of paws on the wet ground. The wolves appeared one by one, their eyes glowing in the dim light. Shadow approached first, sniffing at John's injured leg before letting out a low, rumbling sound that almost resembled concern. Tiny and the other wolf circled him, their movements calm and purposeful. "I can't walk," John admitted aloud, though he wasn't sure who he was speaking to. Shadow seemed to understand. He crouched low, his body solid and steady, nudging John as if encouraging him to lean on him. With their help, John managed to limp back to the cabin. The wolves didn't leave his side, even after he collapsed onto the couch, exhausted and soaked. Tiny lay down at his feet, her warmth seeping through his cold, damp boots. Shadow sat by the door, his ears twitching at every sound outside. The incident changed something in John. He no longer saw the wolves as creatures to be feared or managed. They had become his companions, his protectors. They didn't need words to communicate, their actions spoke louder than anything he could say. One morning, as John prepared breakfast, he caught Shadow watching him. This time, the wolf's gaze wasn't sharp or calculating, it was steady, almost warm. John reached out cautiously, and Shadow stepped forward, pressing his nose against John's palm. The connection was undeniable, a bridge between two species built on trust rather than instinct. The first frost of winter had settled over the forest, its crystalline sheen glittering under the pale morning sun. John stood on his porch, a steaming cup of coffee warming his hands as he watched the wolves darting through the clearing. Their breath formed soft clouds in the crisp air, their movements swift and fluid as they played, their joy untamed by the cold. Bailey lay at his feet, her gaze steady and calm, no longer filled with the suspicion that had once marked her interactions with the wolves. It struck John how far they had all come, from fear and uncertainty to coexistence and trust. And in that moment, he understood that his journey with these creatures was more than a personal story. It was a lesson, a reminder of how much humanity had yet to learn about the natural world. John had grown up with the same stories as everyone else. Wolves were dangerous, ruthless predators to be feared and avoided. They were creatures of legend, villains in fairy tales, and symbols of the untamed wilderness. But living alongside them had shattered those myths. The wolves were fierce, yes, but they were also intelligent, loyal, and deeply connected to one another in ways that mirrored human families. They weren't mindless killers, they were survivors, navigating a world that often saw them as enemies. John thought back to the day he'd found them, three trembling, abandoned pups, their wide eyes filled with fear. They could have grown to fear him or reject his care, yet they had chosen to stay, to trust him despite everything. It was a choice rooted not in instinct but in something deeper, something that bridged the gap between their wildness and his humanity. Over time, John began to notice how the wolves interacted with the world around them. They weren't just predators, they were caretakers of the forest, their presence balancing the ecosystem in ways he hadn't understood before. They hunted only what they needed, never more. Their movements were purposeful, their actions a quiet reminder of nature's delicate equilibrium. This realization shifted something in John. He had once seen the forest as a backdrop for his walks, a place to escape the noise of the world. But now, he saw it as a living, breathing entity, its rhythms intertwined with those of the wolves. They weren't intruders, they belonged here, just as much as the trees, the rivers, and the birds. One afternoon, as he sat at his desk, John began writing. He wrote about the day he found the wolves, the early days of uncertainty, and the moments that had transformed his fear into awe. He wrote about Bailey's initial resistance, the wolves' gradual trust, and the bond that had formed between them. The words flowed easily, each memory vivid and alive. He realized that this wasn't just his story, it was a story for anyone who had ever judged a creature based on fear or misunderstanding. It was a story for those who believed that wildness and humanity were incompatible. John's most profound realization was that trust was universal. It wasn't something exclusive to humans, it existed in the natural world, quietly but undeniably. The wolves had taught him this. By treating them with respect and patience, by seeing them as more than their reputation, he had earned their trust. And in return, they had shown him gratitude, not in words, but in actions. The way they stood by him when he was injured, the way they protected his home, and the way they chose to stay, even when the call of the wild could have easily pulled them away. As John's story spread, shared first with friends, then with a wider audience, he began to receive letters and messages from people around the world. Some shared their own experiences with animals, while others admitted their misconceptions about wolves and other predators. One letter, in particular, stood out. A young girl wrote, "I used to be afraid of wolves because I thought they were mean. But now I think they're amazing, and I want to learn more about them." John smiled as he read the letter, realizing that his story was doing exactly what he had hoped. It was changing perspectives, one person at a time. The wolves continued to roam the forest, their howls echoing through the night like a song of freedom. They were no longer confined by the fear and prejudice that once surrounded them, at least in John's eyes. Bailey, now fully at ease with her wild companions, often joined them on their patrols, her wagging tail a symbol of the harmony that had taken root in their unlikely family. John often stood on the porch, watching the wolves fade into the trees, their silhouettes blending with the shadows. He knew they might one day leave for good, answering the call of their instincts. But he also knew that the bond they had formed would never fade. It was a bond stronger than fear, a bond that bridged the gap between man and nature. And for John, it was a reminder that the world wasn't as divided as it seemed, that even in the wildest of creatures, there was a capacity for trust, loyalty, and connection. As the first snowfall blanketed the forest, John whispered into the quiet air, "Thank you." It was unclear whether he was speaking to the wolves, the forest, or the lessons he had learned. Perhaps it was all three. And in the distance, a single howl rose, carrying with it a promise: the bond they had forged would endure, as timeless as the forest itself. If this story touched you and made you see nature in a new light, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories about the world around us. What do you think happened to the wolves afterward? Did they return to the wild, or did they remain a part of John's life? Share your thoughts in the comments, we'd love to hear from you.